Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon if you are tuning in from our part of the world, and good morning if you're tuning in from the western part of the world. Thank you for joining us. My name is Zishan Salahuddin and I serve as the Director for the Center for Regional and Global Connectivity, or CRGC, at Tabad Lab. Welcome to another Tabad Lab Policy Roundtable, which is a series of very focused discussions and panels that try to dissect some of the most complex problems that are facing Pakistan and the world today. Our topic for today is the drone strike recently conducted in Kabul that killed the last of the 9/11 masterminds, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and the implications for al-Qaeda, the Haqqani network, the IAEA in general, for Pakistan, for the US, and for the region and regional stability in general. The conversation will, of course, also focus a little bit on the US relationship with Afghanistan and Pakistan, among other things. And speaking of the Pakistan-US relationship, in a very sort of shameless plug for Tabad Lab, I want to flag that our new podcast called The Audit, its first episode is out today. The podcast deep dives into the long-term Pak-US relationship, its many intricacies, and the untold stories with decision makers both in the past and in the present. The podcast is produced by Tabad Lab and hosted by the brilliant Adam Weinstein of the Quincy Institute, and the first episode drops today. You can find a link for that in the description of this video across all of Tabad Lab's platforms. But back to the topic at hand, which is the drone strike in Kabul and its resultant implications both in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, for the US, and for the region in general. We have a very august gathering of some of the sharpest minds focusing on various aspects of this issue from across the world, from the US, from Singapore, from Afghanistan, and from Pakistan. I will keep their profiles brief, as if we delved deep into their extensive experiences, we could very easily take over the entire hour or so that we have today. To start off, we have with us Mr. Spencer Ackerman. He is a journalist and an author, known especially for his book, Reign of Terror, How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump. He's written for The New Republic, The Guardian, Wired, The Daily Beast. He has reported from Afghanistan, from Iraq, even from the Guantanamo Bay detention facility in Cuba. He writes extensively in national security, counterterrorism, and intelligence. Welcome, Spencer. Very glad to have you here. We also have with us Dr. Tricia Bacon. Dr. Bacon is an associate professor at the American University's School of Public Affairs, where she directs the Policy Anti-Terrorism Hub. Her expertise lies in the areas of U.S. counterterrorism, terrorist group behavior and decision-making, and the role of intelligence in national security decision-making. She's also the author of Why Terrorist Groups Form International Alliances. So in that regard, I think her perspective on Afghanistan, and especially given the many groups that operate in there, would be especially beneficial to the discussion. Welcome, Dr. Bacon. In a short while, we'll have Ubaidullah Bahir with us as well. He's just a little bit delayed. He is a lecturer. Oh, he's here. Good. He's a lecturer at the American University of Afghanistan and a visiting scholar at the New School in New York. He's an advocate for nonviolent political action and aspires to seek sustainable peace through reconciliation and dialogue in Afghanistan. Welcome, Ubaidullah, and I'm also very grateful to you personally because you were one of the very few Afghans that we were able to secure, given the sensitivity of the situation. It wasn't particularly easy to have Afghans sort of agree to be a part of this conversation. We have Abdul Basit, an associate research fellow at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He specializes in the issues of politics, violence, religious extremism, terrorism, and security, particularly in South Asia. He has co-authored the book Dynamics of Taliban Insurgency in Fatah, specifically the TTP, obviously, and has written extensively in reputed international and national magazines, as well as appeared on multiple television channels and shows within and without Pakistan. Welcome, Abdul Basit. And finally, last but certainly not least, my good friend, Mr. Dr. Adnan Rafiq, is a public policy analyst and development professional with expertise in social sector development, governance, and security. He has led major projects focused on youth empowerment, gender equality, police reforms. Currently, he actually also heads the Pakistan chapter for the United States Institute for Peace as its country director, and in the past has advised both the Interior Ministry and was instrumental in actually putting together the national security policy for Pakistan, which was launched earlier in January. Welcome, Dr. Rafiq. Very glad to have you here. So, getting back to the discussion, I'll start with Spencer and Trisha, if you don't mind. And let's begin with the micro. Al-Zawahiri is dead. The last remaining so-called gray bureaucrat of the Taliban, the last mastermind. The man responsible not just for 9/11, but also seeing the Al-Qaeda organization through an incredibly turbulent time for its existence, particularly the last 23 years of the war on terror, the fact that they hemorrhaged a lot of members and groups to the formation and proliferation of ISIL, its decentralization of the command and control structures. I guess the question that I want to ask you is, the revenge aspect of this notwithstanding, is there any tactical advantage to having killed him? I know you've written extensively on this, both of you, especially Spencer recently. And while the US has been quite adamant about avoiding collateral damage, scores of civilians over the course of the last 23 years have also been killed in strikes aimed to bring al-Zawahiri down. Spencer, I'll start with you, and then Trisha will come to you.
I see very little macro advantage to this. I don't think that it was about gaining any form of substantive preemption or prevention of any kind of imminent Al-Qaeda activity, or even, you know, if you wanted to be generous about it, zoom out toward the kind of reformation or other recoalescence of Al-Qaeda or anything like that. This was about revenge. This was about the fact that for 21 years, al-Zawahiri had left the United States pretty much guessing about his whereabouts and unable to reach him. And then, in perhaps one of the bitterest ironies I can think of, considering the sheer scale of the pain and suffering of the Afghanistan war to both civilians and combatants, the United States ending the war made it possible to finally kill Zawahiri. And I think that was ultimately what this was about.
I see there are several advantages to this strike. I mean, first, you're eliminated of a pretty established Al-Qaeda leader, someone who's well known within the movement, someone who's well respected within the organization. So the organization is trying to rebuild, is trying to reestablish its position in the Sunni jihadist movement. So I think this is a disruptive activity from that perspective. And I think it also has a disruptive effect on Al-Qaeda more broadly. We know the organization is enjoying safe haven in Afghanistan, and this strike on Zawahiri will have created a great degree of uncertainty within the organization about how safe that safe haven is, even in a place like Kabul, which is so clearly under the Taliban's control. So I think this damages Al-Qaeda probably just temporarily, depending on who takes over the leadership of the organization, but it disrupts its ability to try to rejuvenate under the safe haven and to create some uncertainty within the organization, in addition to the justice provided for his role in violence for the last 30 years.
Thank you, Trisha. Those are, of course, very, very valid points. And Spencer, I will come back to you in a little bit later about what Trisha just said about who's going to take over the organization, because there is some argument to be made about how the various chapters of Al-Qaeda are now allegedly independent and operate entirely in silos. So whether or not a centralized leader was even necessary is another question that begs an answer. Ubaidullah, the Taliban have denied any knowledge of al-Zawahiri's presence in Kabul. But the same Taliban have also facilitated talks between the government of Pakistan and the banned an outlawed terror outfit of the TTP. Now, of course, that particular situation is a more complex one because the entity involved, the government of Pakistan, is also at the negotiating table. But both incidents imply that the IEA is in direct violation of the Doha Agreement. And I guess what I want to hear from you is, what does this say of their credibility, their bid for international recognition, and their ability to sort of really convince the international community that they've turned over a new leaf and want to get more into administration and running the country than supporting some of these groups? Ubaidullah, sorry, your mic's off.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I've done this in lectures. I've gone half an hour rants, and then my students tell me that my mic was off. So I'm glad you told me earlier. I think it's always helpful to look at similar cases before this. The legality and legitimacy of the operation is something that isn't talked about often, but I think maybe it should be. I think this trend starts with Anwar al-Awlaqi, who was bombed in Yemen, and then we see the bin Laden assassination. But beyond that as well, with regards to the reaction of the Taliban, I think that considering that Pakistan had the leeway of turning around and using back channel communication to communicate with the United States, and there's obviously a sense of embarrassment when you're caught red-handed like that. So considering the Taliban not having those sorts of back channel communications, I think the most sensible political way forward for them was to just deny it. We saw Ambassador Khalilzad say that there were certain elements within the Taliban that were in contact with al-Qaeda affiliates, while the other groups were annoyed with that violation of the Doha deal, and they might have ratted them out to the United States. As to how true that is, I think we have very little evidence to support that. But yes, they were hosting the Arabs. Now, either the Taliban misunderstood the Doha deal with regards to how operational the people that they host can be, and they might have thought that the emphasis was on ISKP, because if you notice that in the second part of the Doha deal in clause 2, there's a specific mention to the Taliban having to announce that they will oppose groups that are a threat. And they did that in the scholars gathering that they had. They had a special announcement naming ISKP, which to them harms them, but they did it to meet the Doha clause. And I think the United States was generally happy with the security arrangement and the Taliban coming through with regards to the Doha deal. But this happening, I think we saw different reactions. The State Department's initial reaction was very harsh, but we are seeing some level of backing off from the Taliban's part with regard, which gives a sense of wanting to reapproach and mend things. And then we saw Kirby's statement and a few statements coming from the United States. So it looks really bad for the Taliban, but I think it's not the end of the world. And it just shows that this wasn't a CT failure because they are dealing actively with ISKP. This was more of being implicit and complicitly hosting al-Qaeda, either maliciously or thinking that that was okay according to the Doha deal.
Agreed, and thank you for that perspective. I think one of the key things here is that, and we'll discuss this a little bit later, how this is actually going to eventually affect the Haqqani network, the Haqqani part of the current Afghan Taliban, considering that it's widely accepted that the security of Kabul and who goes in and out of it and who stays there and who gets safe passage and haven is primarily up to the Haqqanis. But we'll get to that part of it a little bit later. I want to pivot a little bit to Abdul Basit and Adnan. The killing, has brought into focus what is now called the over-the-horizon counterterrorism strategy employed by the US, and ignited this renewed discussion about its permanence, its performance, its effectiveness, its efficacy. Pakistan has vehemently, of course, denied allowing its airspace for conducting the strike. I would also actually argue, based on a couple of conversations that I've had, conspiracy theorists in Pakistan are also arguing that the Pakistani currency, which precipitously has dropped over the last 3 or 4 months due to an internal political and constitutional crisis, has risen, in fact, quite sharply in the wake of the killing. Do you see this as a precursor to a stitch up to the relationship between the Pakistan and the US? And Adnan specifically, I'd like to know from you your perspective on what does this actually mean for Pakistan? Adnan.
Yeah, thanks, Z. First of all, I think we'll have to look at the bigger picture. And in that, with the US withdrawal, we increasingly saw the US-China rivalry getting the center stage. And I think within that, a lot of analysts worried that, the evolving situation in Afghanistan, how it may affect global security and how, US will sort of deal with emerging or existing threats in Afghanistan and in the region. So I think this is, first of all, a big statement that US is not willing to take the eye off the ball in Afghanistan and will use both stick and carrot if needed to protect its interests. I think that's one of the key points for me. The second is that even for Pakistan and some, there has been some sort of sympathy towards Taliban in a sense that they've turned the leaf and this is Taliban 2.0 and all. I think the actions of the Taliban during the last year should put an end to this sort of view, because not just on women education, but also with these elements staying at such strategic locations within Kabul and this whole saga of TTP, I think this should be a rude awakening for everyone to rethink. And I pretty much would argue that Taliban are essentially the same ideologically, operationally, operating pretty much along the same lines as they did in 90s. Now, yes, they do have pragmatists among their ranks, and the whole sort of policy question is how to strengthen those pragmatists and get Taliban to do what they sort of agreed to under the Doha agreement and what is expected of them. So I think for Pakistan, first of all, for the policymakers, the biggest thing to realize is that if there is a global consensus on one thing, it is on the non-state actors. That this whole saga of non-state actors operating, the whole transnational terrorism and all, this has to be put to an end. And in that, you have China, you have even Russia, US, everyone. If everyone agrees on one thing, it is on this point. And therefore, we need to have greater policy clarity in Pakistan, that there has to be no space for terrorist elements, transnational elements of any hue and color, and also how to contain this threat within Afghanistan. I think one of the biggest questions will be this potential spillover of these elements if they have been emboldened with the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, and if they are looking to expand, how can they be contained? And I think this strike is one way of moving towards that. Border management and border security will be another, being more vigilant within Pakistan and not ceding too much space in tribal areas and in mainland Pakistan to similar elements will be another. So I think the work is cut out for Pakistani policymakers. The global environment is increasingly clear. It does not accept these elements, and the Pakistan would do better to join forces, to put an end to this and move towards geoeconomics and economic stability and all of it. So I can come to it later, the economic, sort of re-engagement between US and Pakistan and all that. But from the security perspective, I think there is an opportunity for this wider sort of clarity on, eliminating or reducing the non-state actors' role on this front.
Thank you, Adnan, for that very comprehensive view and for also painting a picture for what are some of the implications that exist for Pakistan, and perhaps a little more importantly, how its advantage. Mr. Abdul Basit, on over to you. Same question.
We lost your voice. Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Abdul Basit, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Could you speak up just a little bit?
Can you hear me properly?
Yes, yes.
We lost your voice. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. The question that I'd asked had to do with this whole idea of the over-the-horizon counterterrorism strategy that has been employed by the U.S. And one of the key questions was how could this potentially affect Pakistan-U.S. relations, and what does this say about the future of counterterrorism, especially the portion of it led multilaterally by the U.S. In this particular region?
I think if you look at over the horizon counterterrorism capabilities in terms of the attack which took place in Kabul, killing civilians last year when the Taliban took over and there was this suicide attack at Kabul airport, that was way off the mark, and the US tried hiding it, but the New York Times did quite extensive reporting. And then you compare it with this one, this is quite accurate. So I think since then their capabilities have increased. They have shown the will that if there are high value targets, US will take them down, and they have the arrangements in place, irrespective of where the drone came from, where it originated, which airspace it used. The bottom line is they have those arrangements in place, and in future, if there are high value targets, there will be drones coming in this direction once again. Where it leaves the US-Pakistan relation, as Adnan pointed to, the trajectory is an upward trajectory within the limited scope of this relationship that it has vis-a-vis over the horizon counterterrorism. But at the same time, there is that paradox of the Pakistani relationship with the Taliban and the Taliban's ties with Al-Qaeda. I mean, Taliban were telling the world 2-3 days ago, Sirajuddin Haqqani in an interview to an Indian channel said that there is no Al-Qaeda here, the group is dead. And then 2 days later, you have Zawahiri found in a Haqqani safe house. So how the Taliban are going to cope with that dichotomy, I think, and then it will have implications for the Taliban US ties. But as far as Pakistan US ties are concerned, I think on transnational groups, there is an understanding, and I think that will continue, but there will be a denial, and there will be silence on part of both parties. And then, this is how it has been, and this is how it will be. Going forward, we need to see that how the Taliban react to the entire situation, and what Al-Qaeda will do, because I believe now Al-Qaeda will go underground. You won't see their leaders, found in Kabul anymore. That will not happen. So going forward, I think Pakistan will keep quiet on it. And one big implication of this drone strike will be, I think, that the TTP talks, for me at least, they're dead now. They will not move forward. And there will be some implications, negative implications of it for Pakistan-Taliban relationship as well. But we will see this unfolding in the coming days.
Thank you, Mr. Abdul Basit, for that very comprehensive perspective. I find it interesting that your take on the fact that the negotiations with the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, may not now go as originally intended. Just for a little bit of context, since May 28th, negotiations have been underway, or May 18th, sorry, negotiations have been underway between the government of Pakistan and the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan across a range of areas to try and bring the violence between the two sides down, as well as to ensure that the consistency of attacks against the Pakistani state, Pakistani civilians, and Pakistani institutions can be curbed in the coming months and bring some semblance of stability, especially to the border regions. Those talks have been ongoing for quite some time now, and those are the talks that Mr. Abdul Basit was referring to. I'm going to pivot a little bit to Trisha and to Spencer and to Adnan. The Taliban have responded by universally condemning the strike, arguing that it's a violation of international principles. And as we approach the 1-year anniversary of the Kabul takeover, today is August 5th, we're 10 days away from the August 15th 1-year mark of the IEA being in control of Afghanistan. The Kabul strike raises some very important questions about the future of US presence in Afghanistan, the Taliban, and the future of non-militant outfits such as Al-Qaeda. There's an odd intersection between multinational counterterrorism efforts and international law stipulations. What does this say for the future of counterterrorism efforts in Afghanistan? Trisha, I'll start with you. And I just want to remind my guests that if at any point you wish to jump in for an answer to any one of these questions, you're more than welcome to.
I think that there has been a lot of questions and concerns and speculation, and maybe even some skepticism about what over the horizon counterterrorism capability would be in Afghanistan. And there was quite a bit of concern that it would essentially not be a sufficient capability to deal with threats as they arise. And as the first demonstration of over the horizon counterterrorism, this was a pretty effective message. It was a precise drone strike against a high value threat, clearly someone who is a threat to the United States interests. So that kind of precise targeting of a high value individual that was in a very clearly in an area controlled by the Taliban, I think was a really powerful demonstration about what over the horizon counterterrorism capability can do, and probably has quieted some of the skepticism about the ability for the United States to protect its counterterrorism interests in Afghanistan after the withdrawal.
Thank you, Trisha. Spencer, the same question to you. Trisha is of the view that al-Zawahiri was very clearly a threat to the US, and that this precision capability actually sends a very strong message both to the IEA and to Al-Qaeda. And I guess my question to you is more or less along the same line as to what does this say about the future of counterterrorism efforts in Afghanistan at the intersection of multinational CT efforts?
So there's nothing new about the sort of over-the-horizon approach. It's been a strategy that the prior administrations running the war on terror, from the Bush administration to the Obama administration to the Trump administration, have tried to get to, which is to say, sort of stripped of euphemism, outside of the Bush administration's ground wars, maintained in many ways by the prior administrations as much as they would want to divest themselves of it, that this is sort of what they see as the core of counterterrorism, as much in the way as possible of inconspicuous strikes. Obviously, that means primarily inconspicuous to an American audience as opposed to a local audience. With Zawahiri being, the leader of Al-Qaeda, one of the most high value of the so-called high value targets, ironically, that might make a poor demonstration case for the future of counterterrorism, because the question is what does counterterrorism look like below that echelon? There, as I think you can hear from this panel, there's a lot less controversy over taking out someone like Zawahiri, who the United States has, quite a lot of unfinished business with, even if you want to get into the question of whether it is legitimate to execute him. Several echelons down, you wonder. And I think they're probably a better place to look for the future of counterterrorism isn't in a test case like this, but in a place like Somalia, where the Trump administration sort of packed up toward the end of its tenure, moved all the stuff to Djibouti and to Kenya, and now the Biden administration has reversed that to continue to harass and attrit al-Shabaab. And there, that looks a lot more like what we should expect to see, as opposed to the relatively rare and infrequent cases where the CIA, in this case, has tracked down and has the ability to kill a high-value target. If Al-Qaeda's next leader is Saif al-Adil, who, if I'm not mistaken, might still be in Iran, I think that will be also an immense test case for whether the United States would risk a far larger international conflagration over taking a similar action. So I think something like the Zawahiri case, while understandably billed by the Biden administration as a success, particularly with, as it appears right now, the lack of civilian casualties, I'm sure further reporting might complicate this picture, nevertheless might be more of an exceptional case than a test case.
Thank you, Spencer. I do appreciate from all of my panelists the different colors and hues that have been brought in, the various perspective, some of them might even be at odds with each other, but I think that's the whole point of having these policy debates, to have that difference of opinion, to be able to really rationalize, internalize, and debate what are the pros and cons of these events and what they imply for regional stability in this part of the world. One of the things, and this is a question more for Ubaidullah and for Abdul Basit, one of the questions that I'm keen on asking has to do with regional players. Afghanistan, I mean, it's one thing to know that Al-Qaeda is operational inside of Afghanistan. It's quite another to quite literally kill their leader inside of its capital, and no less in a very sort of wealthy part of Kabul. The neighbors of Afghanistan, most of which are actually quite concerned about the various groups that operate inside it, ranging from Pakistan to China to the Central Asian republics, specifically Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, as well as the western border. I guess my question to the two of you is, with the death of Zawahiri, how badly does this affect regional stability in terms of ensuring that Afghanistan can be leveraged to its full potential in terms of infrastructure connectivity, in terms of energy connectivity, in terms of goods movements and cross-border trade, and so on and so forth? And at the end of this question, Adnan, given what you said, I'll come over to you for the economic aspect of it as well. But for now, Ubaidullah and Abdul Basit.
First off, just to touch upon what Dr. Trisha and Spencer, Dr. Spencer would be like, why didn't you call me a doctor as well? But I mean, both the doctors before me, drone strikes have been a more effective tool of eliminating high value targets. It's just that here specifically within the context of can you guys hear me properly? Can you guys hear me? Yeah, I'm told that my voice is very robotic. Is it all right? Okay. Yeah. So I was just talking about
it's
how
okay
like, okay, as a CT tool, it is effective. It's just that you have to contextualize it and understand as to whether what you're getting from it as benefits outweighs the cons. Here's the problem right now with Afghanistan, especially with regards to the black boxing of leadership, the laissez-faire kind of leadership that they have, the fact that an insurgency which was very flat is suddenly turning taller and having growing pains. That means your communication, it fails at two ends. One is the getting in part to the Taliban, and then the information being dispersed to the right parts, right? And this has implications on counter-terrorism as well. You pointed towards the Haqqani network, the fact that you have a group within the Taliban that are hosting Al-Qaeda and the other groups are not aware of it already shows you as to how complicated the leadership structure there is. Now, with regards to regional players and them reaching out to Afghanistan, if you guys remember the border tensions with Pakistan, one of the problems with Pakistan was that their bottleneck or way to access the Taliban was through a specific group. And that information wasn't being dispersed enough or far enough to the elements responsible for the border tensions. So you had JDI, which was intelligence, and within that the Nangarhar province JDI head who was involved in the tensions, and then Mullah Yaqub's defense ministry which was involved. So it's just that there has to be an effort put in by regional players and everyone who's in contact with the Taliban to help them formalize their channels as well, or at least if they cannot get rid of the bottleneck, the international community has to be in touch with the relevant elements. So whenever a problem arises, you can reach out to the exact relevant part of the Taliban, because this isn't a cohesive movement that you're dealing with. And lastly, I just wanted to cover how there has to be an actual discussion of counterterrorism or over the horizon operations, as well as not communicating effectively with the Taliban. How do these two impact the ability of the Taliban to fight ISKP? Because the drone strike within Kabul was not just a message to the Taliban to stop hosting Al-Qaeda, but it also carried a message that said you could be targeted next. which meant that these people are genuinely going into hiding, and there is a huge lack of trust that starts taking place. And we really need to get rid of that, and there has to be continuous communication. So we have to look at what the engagement looks like moving forward. And I'm hoping that these discussions with regards to the Doha deal, with regards to counterterrorism, we have to discuss mechanisms and how we're going to monitor and implement them amongst us, not just with the United States, but with the region as a whole, so that Afghanistan doesn't end up becoming a major spillover into the region, to the globe. Because when the world hears that, they hear interventionism. Afghanistan has had enough of that. And our first priority should be to learn to fix things within the country rather than having the world come in and force fix it for us, which is always temporary.
Just to continue where Ubaidullah left, I think one of the major challenges will be after this incident, to what extent international community and regional players can trust the Taliban, because they said one thing and what happened there was quite another. So the trust factor was already very low, and whatever achievements were made, I won't say they have been reversed, but there has been a major setback to that. But I think the engagement, limited engagement, will continue, and the way regional actors are going to react to it, I think there will be concerns in terms of Pakistan already has its concern for right and wrong reasons. Part of it has to do with its own policies, and part of it has to do with inability to, do anything about TTP, whether they are pursuing kinetic actions or non-kinetic actions. And major concern for all the regional players is ISKP. And I think ISKP is that player which possesses the capability of, mounting high-profile terrorist attacks, not just in Afghanistan. They have done it in Pakistan, and recently we have seen them trying in the border areas of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan as well. So what is the capability of the Taliban in terms of their counter-terrorism, structures? That is quite rudimentary, and the level of cooperation is not there. So Taliban alone can't do it. All kind of help that they can get from regional countries or the international community is at one side, but what the Taliban's commitment is another thing. Because you look at the communication that has taken place or reactions to Zawahiri's killing, for the US, the Doha Agreement, one thing. For the Taliban, it meant a very different thing. They were clear that their commitment was that the Afghan soil will not be used. They never gave a commitment to cut ties with Al-Qaeda or not to shelter them. And then for the US, it was clear violation of the Doha Agreement. So there are those, secret nextures to Doha Agreement. So we do not know what this document really means. In a way, for me, it's ineffective in a sense that it will provide some legal aspects to both parties, but then the commitment is the main part. Is it the international community still ready to trust the Taliban on their counterterrorism commitment? That's the main question. Other things, I think the cooperation will continue, whether it is with Pakistan, Iran, other countries, because the sense I get from the regional countries is this time around, what they see in Afghanistan is Taliban as an opportunity to, engage with them economically and go for the regional connectivity. But then again, the question comes back to, if people like Zawahiri were in Kabul, can those plans materialize? And I think let's hear from Adnan what he has to say on the economic side.
Yeah, thanks, Abdul Basit. Yeah, I agree. I think we'll have to sort of zoom out a little bit and see that all of these problems originated, or they are sort of a burden of the Cold War era, which evolved in the particular way that they did. Now, the way global political economy has shaped up, there is very little appetite and room for the rents that can be accrued from this geopolitics of non-state actors and the proxy wars and so on. I think China has set up an example where it's changed the goalposts through its economic diplomacy, through its purchasing influence, through investments under the BRI, and therefore there's a choice for countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan who are in dire need of economic assistance. Afghanistan has a looming humanitarian crisis on its hand. Pakistan's economy is in doldrums. Both countries need to plug into these evolving geo-economic sort of wrangling in the world, which will be more defined by the BRI and the global partnership on infrastructure development, or the whatever equivalent West comes up with. And there's very little for both the Taliban or the Pakistani policymakers to expect in terms of geopolitical rents by continuing, to pursue, this sort of a legacy of the Cold War era, essentially. So that is the bigger picture. Now, how does it translate into these specific episodes? I think this puts Taliban under enormous pressure. And let's not forget the Pakistani action on Afghan soil as well, which was even more unprecedented when Pakistan bombed certain targets in Afghanistan. So I think the message for Taliban is clear. If Pakistan can go to the extent of taking out elements within TTP in Afghanistan, and US, doing what it has done, Taliban have to make this decision whether they want to be part of this evolving new geoeconomics kind of global competition, or they want to stick with the legacy of the Cold War era. And I think in that, an important factor is that, that all resentment that kind of Al-Qaeda channelized, it also belonged to another era when US was the sole superpower. There was hardly any alternative to the US. And now increasingly, when we see more of a multipolar world, at least a bipolar world emerging, even the sentiment against the West or US has other sort of channels to sort of translate itself. And therefore, again, it will get very difficult, in my view, for the likes of Al-Qaeda to find recruits and to get traction, except, and this is important, for places like Somalia or Yemen or elsewhere in countries like Pakistan. If the governance gets weaker, if there's political instability, then we might see some traction for these sort of elements. So I think for that reason also it is important for US and Pakistan and other countries to agree on some sort of economic reapproachment to help stabilize these countries, to deny space for these disruptive elements, and so that we get into this era of multipolar competition along more economic lines, with some sort of cooperation on counterterrorism, on climate change, on other big global challenges that we face.
Thank you, Adnan. I hope everyone is able to hear me because I'm having a little bit of a connectivity issue.
Zishan's connection is down. Maybe I should start hosting the event.
We seem to have zoomed out quite a bit. We discussed in detail what the implications are, inside of Kabul. We then moved out a little bit more towards implications for Pakistan and for the US. We spoke about the future of multilateral or multinational counterterrorism efforts in Afghanistan, and what might be some of the implications for the region in general, especially when it comes to security, but as far as Pakistan and the Central Asian republics are concerned, more importantly, connectivity and infrastructure development. I want to zoom in towards the end of the conversation a little bit more towards the key players inside of Kabul. The blame at this point for the strike is being squarely placed on the Haqqanis for the facilitation and what some news outlets are calling VIP treatment of al-Zawahiri. He was, as I said before, killed in the very wealthy neighborhood of Sherpur in what is recognized as a Haqqani safe house. I guess the question that I have for Spencer and Dr. Bacon now is, how will the Haqqani network, you feel, respond now? And become the scapegoat for this entire debacle?
It's funny how everyone else is still connected and Zishan keeps getting out.
Sorry, am I not audible?
You
My
are.
apologies, I'm having some...
Okay, yeah, maybe.
Sorry, Dr. Bacon and Spencer, did you
maybe
get my question?
I'll defer to Dr. Bacon because I don't really feel I have much in the way of fidelity on the Haqqani network and its strategy and reaction in response to it.
I didn't get all of the question, but I just did that. The question is about the Haqqanis and their
Yes, and how they will react.
the Haqqanis and how they will react. Well, what we've seen is that the Taliban response today was basically denial. And they were faced with the inevitable choice of being complicit or incompetent. And they went with incompetent. And in a way that, of course, stretches credulity, given what we know about Zawahiri staying at a guest house that belonged to the Haqqani family. So you're right that the blame will fall pretty squarely on the Haqqanis. In the Haqqanis' dealings with the Taliban, we know historically there have been fissures, but publicly there's always been a very united front. And so I don't think we will see anything publicly that sort of makes the delineation that those of us who are longtime watchers of the movement make. And the Haqqanis have amassed a fair amount of power in this Taliban government overall. And so this may be an opportunity for some of the rivals within the movement to try to strip away some of that power, especially given that there are questions about why the US had such detailed information about where Zawahiri was in a way that has to stoke some internal conversations and concerns about leaks or spies within the movement. So I think see very much of it publicly, but beneath the surface, there will be a lot of movement and machinations gone in the wake of this strike.
Yeah, I think we've lost Dr. Bacon.
Oh, you've lost me?
No.
Yeah, I think we've lost her.
Oh, can nobody hear me?
I can hear you.
Did you hear my answer, Spencer?
I did, quite cogent.
Okay. So I'm not sure technically what's going on, but we're having some technical difficulties. And it looks like the final question for us alludes to what I started to talk about, and maybe the other panelists want to weigh in on it, which is how this may play out within the Taliban. So if the other panelists have some thoughts on that, maybe that's a good point to wrap up our conversation if anyone else wants to weigh in on that.
So I'll just weigh in quickly on the last question, if I may, Dr. Bacon. Yeah, so I think, yes, the Taliban can be called a network of networks. It's more of a conglomerate. It's a very decentralized entity. And it used to be primarily a Pashtun movement, but now they have non-Pashtun elements from Tajiks and Uzbeks in their ranks as well. So definitely the group has grown. And as they have come to power, they need to expand it further. So that expansion will continue. And since they are coming to power, so they're going through that transition from being an insurgent entity to a governing entity and a political movement. And those transitions can be very tricky because the kind of conversations you have, they can result in some splintering or disagreements. And this particular incident will definitely going to take a toll internally, as Dr. Bacon said, that under the surface, there will be conversation that are Taliban infiltrated? That there will be a conversation because Haqqanis are considered closer to Al-Qaeda. So was it really worth keeping that intimacy with them, and had it really cost them very closer to their first anniversary, the goodwill, that limited goodwill they built with the international community? They were at the cusp of unlocking perhaps the 3.5 billion of the assets. At least the US was dropping some signals in that direction, but that is not going to happen. A question of gaining legitimacy, I think that is not going to happen. So these conversations will take place. The question of Pakistan's role in it will come in. That was Pakistan somehow involved? So do the Haqqanis need to distance from Pakistan now? So all these conversations come in. The dialogue between the pragmatists and more hardliners within the Taliban will come in, where pragmatists were saying, let's move on now. Let's focus on governance. Let's focus on economy. Let's focus on serving the Afghan people versus keeping these ties with those groups, which cost us our government in the past. And it seems to be happening again. So these conversations will be interesting to observe. And I think what happens to the Taliban will determine what happens in Afghanistan. And that will also determine how the international community and regional states will react to it. Yeah.
Okay, are we going on ourselves?
Yes, please.
Go ahead, Ubaid.
Yeah. I didn't hear Dr. Bacon's last response, but I'll hopefully watch clips and try to find out. I think it was important that she pointed towards the idea of how incohesive the Taliban appear, yet very often they've had this ability to keep it under covers. We've very rarely seen those differences come to the forefront. The Kabul was captured by the Haqqani network. I know this for a fact because I know they were coordinating different specific VIPs and locations within Kabul as they were moving in. That was probably one of the reasons why they could demand more with regards to the booty that was distributed in the form of government positions. So that said, I think it's interesting because I don't know if the Haqqani network, even if it wanted to, can distance itself from Pakistan, but they have been associated with this hosting. Haqqani's own chief of staff apparently rented the house in which Ayman al-Zawahiri stayed. We know that both Siraj and Mullah Yaqub had visited that house. So the Taliban were very aware of what was happening, and again, claiming incompetence here, rather than pinning it on one part of the Taliban and sort of making them the scapegoat, sort of shows you that the Taliban aren't willing to yet make those wedges very evident and let people cash in on it. But I guess the ultimate consequence will be that the Haqqanis, who for months, almost 10 months, were perceived by different policymakers as the more rational part of the Taliban movement, who had been more politically mature in the past 10 months. I think that view is going to take a serious hit. But also, in general, the Taliban strife internally is going to present an opportunity for those who have had an issue with whether the affiliations of the Haqqani network, either with Pakistan or with the Arabs, but generally the role that they were trying to play, and there's a certain sense of ethnic or tribal or Qawmi, if you might call it, tensions there as well. So the Kandaharis will probably try to catch this in. We'll have to see whether it is actually practically possible for them to be sidelined. But again, at the core of it, there's a lot of housekeeping to do on the Taliban's part. With regards to US policymakers, I think this shouldn't be the end of all roads to engagement. I think that the Taliban are a reality, even if we consider it a bitter reality. We have to figure out how to deal with them. Choosing not to deal with the Taliban have two consequences. One is the starvation of 30 to 35 million people who have no option of opting out of the Taliban rule. And secondly, we create grounds for ISKP to find more recruits, to be more operationally active. And the Taliban are your only front of dealing with them. So there are ways forward. We just have to be creative. We just have to have a constant communication channel where we stop losing trust in, be micro-ambitious and grow above it. Again, the Taliban are not just bad, if you want to look at them that way, but they're bad at what they're doing as well. So we have to really learn to work with both scenarios. And hopefully with time, things get better. Those are my 2 cents.
Thank you, Ubaidullah, and my apologies both to our viewers and to our guests. Some technical issues have kept me from engaging with all of you properly. And towards the very end, I think Ubaidullah has touched upon quite a few of those. Just in a minute or so, if I could request the guests, as Ubaidullah has done, to perhaps go over some of the policy recommendations, both in terms of the US pursuing its counterterrorism strategy in the region, as well as for Pakistan, as in what it should do for the medium to long-term stabilization of Afghanistan and improving the overall regional security of the region.
Yeah, if I may, I think key for me here is not just engagement, but I would go a step further and say and call it conditional incentivization. I think this is what still needs to be done, conditional incentivization of some of these pragmatic violent actors who may be persuaded to shun violence and join the economic paradigm that I mentioned, with the specter of kinetic CT operations still hanging over their heads. I see this as a practical way forward. Let's see how all of these actors recalibrate in the light of recent developments and how they change their practices.
Quickly, if I can, I couldn't agree more with Ubaidullah and Dr. Adnan. I'll just add that if this is not the end of the road, it might be the beginning of a new one, might be a wake-up call for the Taliban, and they might revisit some of their strategies, who knows. And I think the center of gravity of Afghanistan should be people of Afghanistan who have suffered for the last 40 years. And I think that should be the lens through which the US should look at it, and I think that is the lens through which even Pakistan should look at it. So our Afghan policy has to be people-centric, and security should be just one part of it. We can't reduce Afghanistan just to a security black hole and then only look at it in terms of counter-terrorism strikes and Zawahiri and these groups there. The bigger chunk of it is the Afghan people who have suffered, and we need to make life easier for them. It hasn't become any easier for them since the Taliban took over. So I think this is not the end of the road. I think life will move on. The limited engagement will continue, and there will be carrots and sticks there for the Taliban. It depends on them, as I said, how the Taliban move on from this. And since it came in the first year, it might have been a blessing in disguise for them. Who knows?
I'll just jump in on that as well. I think both Abdullah and Abdul Basit have made really not just excellent points, but hit on the central point. First, the United States has retained essentially a boot on the neck of the Afghan central bank, and much of Afghanistan's sovereign wealth is now in my hometown of New York. That has to stop. The United States, if it is no longer, if it maintains that Afghanistan is a sovereign country, it simply can't do this. The contributions to the immiseration of the Afghan people will ultimately undo whatever the United States thinks it can accomplish from the perspective of counterterrorism. And then secondly, the United States has to determine whether, from a counterterrorism perspective, it considers the main issue to be the Taliban / the Haqqani network or ISKP, where it has cooperated with the Taliban in the past, including during the terminal phase of the end of the American war in Afghanistan. There was a moment earlier this week when some of the Biden people were talking to reporters ahead of the announcement formally of the killing of Zawahiri, where there was an oblique mention of ongoing communication, cooperation going forward being possible. That struck me as an oblique reference to the future of US-Taliban interactions over ISKP. And if ISKP is the issue, then that can, I think, point to a path forward for the U.S. in the bitter reality is, Abdullah mentioned that the U.S. has lost this war and the Taliban are empowered now.
I think my colleagues have touched on a lot of the critical points. I absolutely agree that the primary concern is the welfare of the Afghan people, and the starvation that's going on there is an utmost concern. When it comes to counterterrorism, I think the U.S., as Spencer has rightly pointed out, has a tension that I don't think it will be able to resolve. I think it will continue to pursue al-Qaeda and trying to make sure that the group is diminished and that whoever comes to the helm of the organization does not contribute to some kind of revitalization, at the same time while going after ISK. I don't think that the United States can or will choose between one of those two priorities, which may make both of them slightly less effective, but I think that there is a difficulty that it has to negotiate as long as the Taliban continues to sponsor and provide safe haven for al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations.
Thank you, Dr. Bacon. That effectively wraps up our discussion for today. This has been a very comprehensive, very holistic, very robust debate on the aftermath or the follow-up of the drone strike that happened in Kabul. I'm very grateful to all of my guests, not only for sparing their time, but for also towards the very tail end, summing it all up in these very comprehensive policy recommendations that were absolutely necessary for us to be able to process this particular issue, but also sort of think about what are some of the steps moving forward. So thank you once again, Spencer Ackerman, Dr. Trisha Bacon, Abdul Basit, Dr. Adnan Rafiq, and Ubaidullah Bahir for sparing your time. And thank you also for the audience for tuning in today. This has been another Tabadla Policy Roundtable. Thank you for your attendance, and we will see you on the next one. Take care, goodbye, and Khuda Hafiz.